Welcome to Herbal Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbal Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, where you can listen live at 90.3 WHPC or online at your favorite podcast place after the show. Herbal Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. My guest today is author Ottavia Garcia, and she wrote a beautiful book called The Curandrex Toolkit, Reclaiming Ancestral Latinx Plant Medicine and Rituals for Healing. Ottavia is guided by her dreams and her Mexican, Polish, Hungarian, and Diné ancestors. She studied feminist studies at Stanford University and received her master's degree in the Indigenous Mind program at Naropa University. Ottavia has studied healing arts extensively for over 30 years and has been mentored by herbalists, curanderas, and traditional knowledge keepers. She works as a clinical herbalist and teacher and is dedicated to remembering the healing traditions of her ancestors and supporting others to reconnect with their ancestral medicine. And she is the founder of the Ancestral Apothecary School of Herbal, Folk, and Indigenous Medicine in Oakland, California. And she currently lives in Albuquerque, where we are catching up with her today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ottavia.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Ellen. I really excited to have a conversation.
And it sounds like we have actually walked on several similar paths. And I've spent a lot of time in Indigenous areas, and many of my books discuss our teachings from those various areas. But I love how you're bringing together the many aspects of yourself in really offering this book, The Curandrex Toolkit. And what a beautiful book it is. What does that word mean, Curandrex?
Curandrex. Yeah, it's actually I would say it's a new word, in at least in English and in Spanish, a newly developed word. I'll just say like a curandera or curandero it's basically, in Spanish, it just means a healer, or one, curar is to heal, so one who heals. And that is the name of a traditional healer, often gets called folk healer, or, in Mexico, well, throughout Latin America, or wherever there's Latino, Latinx people. So the word curandero or curandera means healer. In this class, this book, I'll say, just to give some context, this book came out of a class of the same name, which when I originally first taught it about 12 years ago, was called the Curandera's Toolkit. And I wanted to create a class that was herbal medicine based, informed, talking about herbal medicine, but informed by a perspective of my ancestors, in this case, my Mexican ancestors, the culture, the traditional medicine that come from Mexico. So through the years, the name changed to Curandrex as language changed, just to be more gender inclusive. A lot of, now instead of Latino, we say Latinx. So the name changed to Curandrex to include, so it wasn't gendered male or female, and also included space for people who didn't assign themselves a gender, so non-binary, non-gender conforming, and trans people. So the class became the Curandrex Toolkit. And then when I began to write the book, really inspired by the class, I just kept the same name. So it's another name for a healer. I like the word Curandrex because, part of what this book is I interviewed 13 community healers mostly from the Bay Area, although one's in Los Angeles and one's in Denver, but they were all people who were part of my community of practitioners remembering, reclaiming, and practicing, our ancestral medicine of curanderismo. And it seemed like a lot of people were very shy or hesitant to use the word curandera, like to say, I'm a curandera, I'm a curandero, because many of us had teachers, in my case, Doña Enriqueta from Oaxaca or Stella Roman from Cuernavaca, who, are just great, powerful curanderas who, really almost on an elevated status. And so I think part of this path is humility. So it's also a humble thing to not say, I'm a curandera. So anyways, I find curanderics nice because it's contemporary, and it also identifies and gives a name for the movement of practitioners like myself who are, maybe we weren't, born, trained from a young age, practicing in our communities, a lifetime, but we're finding our way back to the practices and reviving them and offering them to our community. So for me, curanderics, it's to name this group of healers at this time, certainly in the United States, but I would say, again, down into Mexico, into the Latinx, communities across the continent, just to mean someone who's a healer.
It's a good explanation of where that word came from, because it is, something that's evolving and newer, and yet you tap into a lot of ancient knowledge there as well. Because my grandmother, who is from Greece, used a lot of these same techniques. And then when I lived many years in southern Mexico, literally in a grass shack, studying with curanderas there, they also did not necessarily call themselves that. Even though they were elderly, they were doing it one for 80 years. And they even understood the energetics of the plants so deeply that some plants, when we went out and gathered it and pulled the bark up, acted as an emetic, which means it would make someone throw up if they needed to do that. And that same plant, if you pulled the bark down, would act as a laxative and bring things out the other end. I found that so fascinating that later in life, I took those plants to natural product chemistry laboratories to study if there was a difference in the chemistry if you pulled the bark up and you pulled the bark down. But it also had to do with the one that you pulled up, you did that in the morning. And when you pulled it down, you did that in the evening. And that made them have different chemical constituents. So I always find it so fascinating because the ancestral plant medicine and rituals work. And very often, once they are studied, we actually can find, a scientific and measurable reason as to why they work.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'd never heard of that, but that's a great example of traditional indigenous plant knowledge.
Right. Well, every day I learn things that I never heard before. I know someone just said to me who wants to be, an herbal student studying to be a registered herbalist, so when does it end? I said, I don't know. I'm in my 70s. I've been doing it since I'm born. I don't see any end point. Do you?
No, it's a lifetime of work. Yeah, there's always more to learn. Plants have so much to teach us. I mean, in some cultures, and you probably came across this, Ellen, a healer or herbalist would really work primarily with just one plant, right? Their whole lifetime, their whole practice. So
that
even
is
one
such a
plant.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that is a beautiful point, because you have on the cover of your beautiful book a lot of plants that if people were to look at the book, would recognize, because they grow, many places in the world. Let's say dandelion, you have right on the front cover.
Mm-hmm.
And just dandelion, you could spend a lifetime. And also, it wasn't like if you had plants growing outside your house, that's the plants you used as an herbalist. You didn't go to an herb store that imported yohimbe from Africa.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what part of this book for me was trying to orient people who are specifically in California, and even more specifically in Northern California, to the plants that are growing in abundance just all around them, like whether it's in their yards or in the parks or, it's landscape plants, because again, I think it's a more traditional herbalist approach is like exactly like you said. We don't go buy our plants. We work with what's growing around us, or we learn to plant and tend gardens of what grows well and easily around us. And, Northern California is a Mediterranean climate. It's such a forgiving and easy place to grow a lot of medicinal herbs. So one of the chapters is all about herbal gardening. I call it, like tending to our gardens, like to really convey to the reader that, being an herbalist is also about developing a relationship with plants, which, from seed to harvest to the medicine making, right? The whole process. And that by learning to grow our plants, the plants continue to teach us through that process. But we also create, I like to think of our medicine chest in our backyard or in our neighborhood. So we learn to like break that, that consciousness or that dependence on thinking that we have to go outside and buy it or pay for it. But instead, there's these plants all around us. And that's, I learned that too also from my time with Doña Enriqueta when I lived with her in Oaxaca. Is if she needed a plant, we would just, go out into the campo and find it and harvest it and bring it home. I think we're also at a time where we also have to have consciousness about that, because I'm sure you know or have talked about, Ellen, just that so many of our medicinal herbal medicines are at risk of being over-harvested, or their habitat have been encroached by development or whatever it is. So I also was very conscientious that the plants I talked about are ones that are very easy to grow, or they exist, in an abundance like weeds in nature. And every plant on the cover is, that cover was a very intentional design. I worked with my designer throughout the book to choose, the images of plants that I actually was writing about in one way or another in the book. So dandelion is in there, rosemary, mint. But another thing I want to say is that in my research for the book and also in my life, I found it very curious that and I'll talk about Mexican and Mexican-American curanderismo, or, traditional herbal knowledge, is that a lot of the plants that are the go-to, top, 5 or 10 herbs that people use for their medicine, or their limpias, which is like a spiritual cleansing, or for a baño, like a herbal bath, many of those plants actually are not native to Mexico, but actually came, from Europe. So that's why, we recognize them, like rosemary or yarrow. Oh, well, no, yarrow was there, or rue or chamomile. I just found it fascinating how, if we look at the history of colonization of Mexico, it was pretty horrific, and a lot of people were killed, and a lot of knowledge was intentionally destroyed. But the people, the Mexican people managed, to still find a way to incorporate and bring into their practices the plants that had come, from colonizers.
Yeah, really quickly. One good example of that here in the U.S. would be plantain. And plantain probably jumped ship, not that long ago, just when the Europeans started coming. But by the time our westward expansion happened, and people went out there, Native Americans and Native peoples were already using it medicinally, even though it was a new plant for them, but it spread so quickly.
Yeah, I've heard it, plantain. I'm not sure what native language, but it gets translated as white man's footprint.
Yes.
So yeah, where the colonizers, settlers went, they left that. Yeah. And another thing I wanted to do in the book too is also highlight the plants that are indigenous to Mexico, or like the southwest U.S. also. Well, was Mexico. We could go into the whole conversation about the border, but anyways, to highlight the plants that actually were here before European contact, and also bring those kind of back into more of an awareness and appreciation, certainly in my life and, in the lives of my students and community, but also in the greater herbalist community, because another motivation for this book was to write it was the more I learned about, the traditional herbal knowledge of Mexico, I realized that it's a very sophisticated, very advanced system, and I'll just focus in on plant medicine of healing, of all the ways that plants were used. But that because of when the Spanish came, they, destroyed so much, literally burned books and destroyed libraries and, murdered the medicine keepers, that a lot of that knowledge was kind of interrupted by colonization. But a lot of the remnants still exist. A lot of it went underground and was practiced just in families or in secret.
As happens with all traditions. Look at Judaism in Eastern Europe. But I want to remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse. And today, my guest is Atava Garcia Swaisiki. Not sure if I'm saying her last name wrong, right? But we're talking about her beautiful book, The Cuanderex Toolkit. And we're so happy to have you here today, reclaiming ancestral Latinx plant medicine and rituals for healing. Let me ask you, Atava, about the on your beautiful cover. I think everyone should look at it, because just looking at this, the artwork is phenomenal. You're bringing in these beautiful plants, and we'll go into some of them in detail. But what about the clay cup? Tell us about the symbolism of that.
Definitely, yeah. And I've had many people ask about that. So that is in Nahuatl, which is the language of the Mexica people of Central America, a very still mother indigenous language, still spoken by millions of speakers in Mexico. It's called the Popoxcomitl, which translates to the smoking vessel. And in Spanish, it sometimes gets called a copalera or a saumedio, which basically mean like a copalera is the place where you would burn copal, or saumedio relates to smoke. So it's a vessel that is actually, again, ancient. They if you go to like the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City, we'll see old, hundreds or thousands of years old vessels like this made of clay. So they were traditionally used to burn copal, which is like an incense. It's actually botanically in the Bursera species, so related to frankincense, also related to palo santo. So it's a resin of a tree, the Bursera tree, the genus Bursera. So it's a white sap that comes, it actually has different colors. Some of the copal is white, some is more yellow, we call it amarillo, or copal negro, which is black. But it's all harvested from the same trees and is used in ceremonies, so in a lot of whether it's it's to celebrate the harvest or the first rain or whatever ceremony, the copal would be placed on little pieces of like burning wood to create smoke, and then it's also a very important tool used in our healing ceremonies, such as the Olympia, which is like an energetic cleansing of the mind, body, spirit, where a lot of different elements are used.
Well, wait, let's go into that a little bit more, because that's an interesting concept, I'm sure, myself, because I am Spanish speaking. In fact, that was my first language. So most of our Spanish speaking listeners, all of them, in fact, will recognize that word. It means cleansing, limpia, clean. So you're using it, though, in more of a not only physical, but spiritual sense. Exactly,
yeah. And the limpia is a practice, a traditional medicine practice that exists, I would say, again, all throughout the Latinx diaspora. And also, I think it's beyond that. Like, it's definitely versions of it are practiced, throughout Europe, throughout the African continent. I mean, I think traditional people and, in the past and contemporary have thought about, we don't just clean like physical body, but sometimes people need like a spiritual cleansing or an emotional cleansing. So Olympia it's a ritual or a practice that can be done, often traditionally it would be someone would receive it from the curandera, like they would go to the healer to receive the limpia. In my teachings, I also like to teach people how to do their own self-limpias, because sometimes we don't have that access to see a healer or whatever is going on. Especially in COVID, we really focused on self-limpia. But, a really common reason someone will have a limpia, and you'll recognize this word too, is if someone has a susto, which is like a shock or a fright or something, tragic happens. Maybe they've lost a loved one, or they witness an accident, or, something. A susto just means, something that scared them, and it can be small, or it can be a really big susto, like say someone surviving war, right? So
something like we call that, we have our own name for it, PTSD.
Yeah, similar to PTSD. Yeah, so someone may go to receive a limpia for a susto, but it also could be like I've given limpias for people they're heartbroken, or they just feel like they were in this situation and they picked up a lot of negative energy, or maybe it's a transition, like they gave birth. Like it can be many reasons to have a limpia, but it's a way to just kind of release, energies, in a more modern term, we would say more like the etheric body or the emotional body, the aura, like that are impacting our emotional health and our physical health. Like one of my teachers, Don Lorenzo, who's also from Oaxaca, when he would talk about limpia, he says, we clean our house, we clean our car, we may like take a bath, but what about cleaning our spirit or cleaning our energy? Like we have to do that. Again, and it's a more traditional indigenous, framework to think about like the body beyond just the physical body. So in the limpia, and it's very much an herbal practice too, because one of the key elements of a limpia is we gather a bundle, or a broom, they'll call it like a rama of fresh herbs. So, and they're always aromatic herbs like rosemary, in Spanish we call romero, is commonly used, or basil, which is albahaca, lavender, ruda, rue, whatever the herbs. And again, and I really encourage people to gather what's available and accessible around them, or what they're growing in their garden. So we gather the bundle of fresh herbs, and then that bundle of fresh herbs is literally used like a broom to sweep over the person's body, and literally like touching the person's body with the bundle of herbs. So you're literally like cleaning the body off. And another of my teachers, Estelle Roman, when she would talk about the limpia, she says, well, it's just like sweeping your house. Like you get every crack, you get every crevice, you go under the under the rug and under the couch. So it's also like thinking about the body and sweeping all of everything you want to release off. So if I'm doing the limpia, it's like, what do you want to let go of? Is it the sadness? Is it maybe you're really resentful about something? Because it's also a place to release the emotions that are heavy, or that are just causing us distress in some way. And what the herbs do is they're really good, right? I think it's actually a form of aromatherapy. Like they are pulling away energies, and they're also blessing us with their aroma, their color, just their presence. And so usually with the second part of the limpia, I also I'm guiding people to call in, what energies are you calling into your life now that you've released things. And I think the herbs are also really beneficial for that, as well as I'll bring in fresh flowers, and some limpias like are just done with roses. Like there's so many versions of a limpia. And
it might change. Depending on what you're talking now about, something that you would do with someone actually with you.
Exactly.
They're with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
But in your book, do you describe how people could, it's hard to do maybe for yourself, or you certainly can do it for yourself, but do you describe how someone would have that ritual done? Or would they have to actually be with you?
No, actually in the book, I give very detailed step-by-step instructions on how someone can do this for themselves. Because like I said, it's,
let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
What would it be? Are you using feathers? Are you using steaming? Like exactly how would they do that?
Yeah, well, the first thing I always tell people is just to like think about your intention and set your intention. Like what is the, like, what are you letting go of? Like, say, I'll just think of an example. Like say somebody had a surgery and they're better, but they just still have a little bit of susto from whatever. Maybe they broke their leg and needed it, set. So whatever the intention is, and then you would really create an altar or some sort of sacred space that reflects your intention. And I always say it's important to have all the 4 elements there, like a vessel of water, a candle, and whatever tools people use. Like some people may work with feathers, some people may work with stones. Like I think it's really also about learning using what we have, working with what we have. Gathering the bundle of herbs and the fresh herbs. And another tool that we use a lot is just an egg, like a plain raw egg. The egg also is rubbed around the body or across the body to pull off energy. So when I lead self-Olympias, we'll just kind of get all of our tools, and I often say start at the head and just start rubbing the herbs or, brushing the herbs over your head. And what is a responsibility as we're doing this work in ourselves is to really use our mind to visualize, like, what am I letting go? What do I want to release? Kind of attuning to the body, like maybe we know, like, say we're holding a lot of anger in our stomach or, fear in our kidneys. And so go to those areas and really work with the breath, work with movement.
And it's amazing. We're coming to where we're going to sign off, but I do want to give you a chance. And thank you so much for describing that beautiful ritual. I was listening to it and actually could feel some of those things happening, such as anger being released. I don't tend to be angry, whatever. Just feeling that change in the energy field. So thank you so much for that. What is the best way for people to find you and to find your beautiful book, Atava?
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. Yeah, so I have my business is called Ancestral Apothecary. So I have 2 websites, one my personal website and one for the school. So ancestralapothecary.com is my website, so for my healing work, for my teaching. And then the school I founded, which is now virtual on Zoom, started in Oakland and will remain in the Bay Area. But that's ancestralapothecary.school.com.
And I want to thank you, listeners, so much for tuning into Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, you can email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.